An American ambassador had been sent to Paris to demand indemnities for seizures which had been made on American ships during peace. The United States government did not expect the acquisition of the entire colony, limiting their hopes to the possession of New Orleans. And the American ambassador listened to these proposals with a certain amount of distrust, supposing that they might cloak some desire to evade giving him the satisfaction which he claimed. In the meanwhile, a new envoy, a Mr. Monroe, arrived in Paris, vested with full powers. Monsieur Barbé Marbois, the French negotiator, immediately approached him. Mr. Livingston, the first envoy, had offered 30 millions as the price of Louisiana, Monsieur de Marbois demanding 80 millions. In the end, the American envoys agreed to the price of 80 millions, but stipulated that of this sum, 20 millions should be applied to indemnifying the American citizens for their losses, so that the purchase money would be reduced to 60 millions. Napoleon, who at first would have been satisfied with 50 millions, now desired that the 20 millions reserved for the settlement of indemnities should also be paid into the treasury. But the news which he received of the English armaments and the impossible claims which the English government kept putting forward rendered him less exacting and induced him to hurry on the termination of the convention. He feared lest the rupture might break out before the session had been accomplished, in which case he would only have had an empty title deed to offer the Americans. 2 conventions were signed on April 13, 1803, the first relating to the payment of the price of the cession, so as not to mix up the abandonment of France's sovereignty with a question of a money sale. Another deed stipulated the conditions of the cession. Napoleon caused an express clause to be inserted in this deed to the effect that the inhabitants of Louisiana should be maintained and protected in the enjoyment of their liberties and of their properties, and in the exercise of the religion which they professed. The English government was profoundly irritated on seeing the Americans become masters of Louisiana. Our adversaries lost, in this way, all hope of ever regaining their preponderance in America. Napoleon's foresight was thus entirely justified. Only a few days had elapsed since the signing of the convention when war was declared. But Louisiana had become American property, and England could undertake nothing against this colony. England hastened on the rupture. 10,000 fresh sailors were enrolled. The militia was called out under the lying pretext that formidable armaments were being prepared against England in the ports of France and Holland. In vain were the most convincing explanations given to the English ambassador. The minds of the English ministers had been made up. It was evident that in signing the Peace of Amiens, the English government had only wished for an armistice, with the mental reservation of breaking the peace as soon as it suited its interest to do so. The unexpected retirement of Mr. Pitt had given reason for the hope that England wished for reconciliation with France. As a matter of fact, Pitt had recognized that the man who had declared eternal war with France could not sign a treaty of peace with her. His self-esteem would have suffered too greatly at being forced to accept conditions so different from those for which he had once hoped. He had accordingly thought it his duty to retire, his successor being one of his adherents, Mr. Addington, son of the doctor of Lord Chatham, Pitt's father. Mr. Addington had been Pitt's schoolfellow and had remained his friend. Pitt, although absent, continued to direct the English ministry. The experiment which he had tried had succeeded. Shortly after the Treaty of Amiens, England, which at first had accepted peace favorably, found it onerous. She had enjoyed the sole monopoly of commerce. She alone during the war had drawn profit from the sea and the colonies. Peace gave her competitors and reduced her profits. The first consul had sent his aide-de-camp, Lauriston, to London as the bearer of the ratification of the treaty. He had been received in London with enthusiasm. The horses in his carriage had been unyoked, and he had been drawn in triumph to the house of Downing Street. But neither the government nor the big traders shared these sentiments with the people. France had scrupulously fulfilled all the engagements which she had assumed on signing the peace. The Kingdom of Naples and the Roman states had been evacuated in less than 3 months, whilst in England no arrangements whatsoever had been made for the evacuation of the island of Malta. The intention of prolonging the occupation was even hinted at. The English newspapers insulted the head of the French government with the most spiteful articles and scattered broadcast the most lying reports. The hatred of France burst out, even in the Houses of Parliament. Articles in the Moniteur, almost all dictated by the First Consul, replied with dignity and indignation to these venomous attacks. Napoleon was too susceptible to the libels of the journalists. Offenses from a hostile country and government could have been explained, but the tolerance, the protection even, which the English pamphleteers found in a country which had recently been reconciled to France showed him how little anxious the English government was to maintain friendly relations with him. They denoted very hostile feelings towards France. Napoleon had been blamed for the words which he addressed to Lord Whitworth during the audience at which he received a diplomatic corps. It had not, indeed, been admitted till then that the head of the government should treat with foreign ambassadors otherwise than in private audiences. Sovereigns, indeed, only treated with the governments of other countries through their ambassadors. This violation of a constant practice could not but profoundly offend a government whose conscience could not bear the public exposure of its politics. The bitter indignation which the iniquitous proceedings of the English government excited in Napoleon's mind justified such an attack to a certain extent. It is none the less true that this scene produced, and could not but produce, a deplorable effect, and that it would have been much better for a man of Napoleon's greatness to have abstained from it. The French government complained bitterly of the tolerance accorded to these indecent attacks and vile calumnies. The London cabinet replied that owing to the liberty of the press in England, it was impossible to do justice to these well-founded grievances. A French newspaper written by Peltier, and the organ of that riffraff amongst the exiles, gained notoriety by the violence and the atrocity of its provocations. At the request of the French ambassador, Peltier was prosecuted for incitation to murder. The pamphleteer was defended by Mr. Mackintosh, MP, and a small fine was inflicted, which was never paid. This celebrated barrister was the same year appointed to one of the most important posts in the law courts in British India. Amongst the pamphlets which Peltier's sheet, L'Ambigu, published, the one which provoked the most serious objection on the part of the French government was an ode titled La Napoleone, written in his youth by Charles Nodier. This circumstance prompted me to point out how greatly the persecution to which it is pretended that the writer was subjected by Napoleon has been exaggerated. I even believe that he greatly exaggerated its importance himself, and that he sought after emotions in the imaginary persecutions, of which, all in good faith, he imagined himself to be the hero. I know of no measure taken against him which emanated from the First Consul's cabinet. Nodier was a man of imagination and full of chivalrous ideas, which prompted him to take sides against the victor, no matter who the vanquished might be, Republicans, exiles, chouans, or friends of the fallen government. His youthful attachments and affections mixed him up in royalist intrigues. The overthrow of his hopes inspired him with a hatred against the First Consul on Napoleon's accession to power, which the establishment of the imperial government by no means helped to assuage. This antipathy of his he betrayed in La Napoleon, a virulent philippic which was reproduced by the newspapers of all the hostile government, and which naturally attracted the attention of the police to its author, but it would be attaching too much importance to the attacks of a man who had talents, no doubt, but who was certainly obscure, to admit any possibility of a personal and continued struggle between so feeble an adversary as the head of a powerful state. Napoleon had something else to do besides wasting his time over the impotent hatreds which this person inspired. He could but commit them to the vigilance of the authorities, which is what he did in this case. The persecution of which Nodier complained was not, moreover, a very violent one, seeing that after a detention of a few months at Sainte-Pelagie, he was sent back to his home to Besançon. The exaltation of his ideas led him on to commit fresh acts of provocation, which exposed him to further disgrace. His perseverance in his hostility, his relations with angry men, his love of independence, and a poetical imagination made him quit his retreat to indulge his vague reveries in the mountains of the Jura and of Switzerland. After leading this wandering life for some time, he was allowed to return freely to Besançon, where he was even taken under the protection of the prefect, Jean Debray. He obtained an authorization to open a class of literature and was allowed to live, thanks to the indulgence of the authorities, without molestation. He afterwards went to Illyria, where he became the secretary of his former persecutor, Fouché, formerly Minister of Police, who was at that time governor of these provinces. He occupied various lucrative posts at that time in the imperial government and even edited a paper under the protection of the various governors who succeeded each other in the Illyrian provinces. The events of 1814 brought him back to France. I have perhaps spoken at too great length about Monsieur Nodier, but in entering into all these particulars, I wanted to show how in reality the rigors of which he pretended himself to be the victim will not bear investigation. I take this opportunity of saying that the existence of the alleged secret societies in the army, the history of which this same Nodier published in 1815, is entirely imaginary and may be attributed alone to his love of romance and to his craze for conspiracies. The emperor, in spite of all his sources of information, who was never ignorant of anything that went on in the army, was never able to find any traces of mysterious associations, of hidden compacts, of sects, of Philadelphians or others under the direction of a single chief or of a secret council. Napoleon's powerful hand, which energetically restrained all those inclinations for trouble and disorder, which are hidden under the words liberty or independence, and his vigilant eye prevented the formation of secret associations. If certain hidden attempts in this direction attained some semblance of execution, it is not until he had gone, or towards the end of his reign, when the elements of his force and his power were dissolving under the baneful influence of his reverses, and when he was no longer served with the same zeal. It is only, therefore, by a propensity natural to romantic minds that the attempt has been made to connect, as proceeding from a common starting point, rare and isolated facts, or solitary attempts which bore absolutely no relation to each other. This digression on Charles Nodier must not lead me to forget an event which occurred in the midst of the grave preoccupations of the time, an event which might have had fatal consequences. In the beginning of 1803, the first consul, being then at St. Cloud, wanted to drive a carriage with 4 horses. Madame Bonaparte and her daughter Hortense were in the carriage. Napoleon mounted the box in front of the steps of the St. Cloud parterre. On arriving at the railings which separate this parterre from the private part, he lost control over the horses, which were young and fiery. They dashed up against the railings with such violence that Napoleon was thrown from his seat and hurled 10 paces away onto the gravel. I watched his departure with some slight anxiety, but had been reassured as I saw him driving quietly away. A sudden cry and the sight of the stoppage of the carriage made me fear that some accident had happened. I ran up and arrived in time to see the first consul seated on the ground trying to collect his thoughts. Fortunately, this fall had no bad consequences. No bones were broken or sprained, and there was no reason to fear any internal injury. Napoleon came off with a sprain and a few scratches and was obliged to carry his right arm in a sling, which prevented him from signing any papers for a few days afterwards. Lord Whitworth, who was appointed English ambassador to France in the month of June, did not arrive in Paris till the middle of November. General Andreossi, who was only awaiting the departure of the English ambassador from London, set out at once as soon as he heard that Lord Whitworth had started. The latter's mission, to all appearance, was to bring about a rupture of the peace. After the hostile proceedings and the entirely unwarranted recriminations, particulars of which are known, the English government crowned the series of its aggressions with a very clumsy manifesto, which was based on pretexts of transparent falseness. This declaration of war had, according to the British custom, been preceded by an order that not only French warships, but the French merchant service and ports were to be treated as hostile. Open hostilities had thus preceded the rupture of peace. French vessels had been captured in our ports and on the ocean, and a general embargo had been laid on all ships belonging to France and to Holland, as well as on their crews and cargoes, even before the declaration of war was made public. It was to retort on these illegal and unjust seizures of men and ships carried out in violation of all international law by command of the British government that the First Consul ordered the arrest of all Englishmen, both civil and military, who were found on French territory at the time of the declaration of war. Parleys, however, continued with the English ambassador, who had remained in Paris. The First Consul made every effort to maintain peace and declared that whilst he could not consent to any derogation from the Treaty of Amiens, he would give England any guarantees of safety which might be considered necessary. The English ministry only replied with proposals which were contrary to the formal text of the treaty. The First Consul, taking his stand on the terms of the treaty alone, had appealed to the arbitration of the powers which had signed it. He had specially insisted that the island of Malta should be handed over to the keeping of the Emperor of Russia. The emperor had answered the proposal of arbitration with an offer to act as mediator. He agreed to accept the charge of the island for a period of 10 years and asked that its government, which was to have been vested in the Grand Master of the Order, should be placed under the control of the commander of the Russian garrison. On the 25th of April, Lord Whitworth presented as the ultimatum of his government. This ultimatum being communicated not in writing, but by word of mouth, that England should continue to occupy Malta for 10 years. And further, that Lampedusa, a small island in the Mediterranean which belonged to the Kingdom of Naples, should be handed over. The ambassador declared at the same time that unless this ultimatum were accepted in 7 days, he was ordered to demand his passports. The First Consul opposing to these high-handed matters, his constant desire to maintain peace, proposed to entrust the care of Malta to Russia. Until the final settlement of the various differences between France and England, Lord Whitworth replied that the refusal of Russia to accept the charge of the island rendered any such step impossible, which was false, seeing that the emperor had consented to take charge of it. The English ministry, thinking no doubt that Napoleon only demanded the evacuation of Malta to save his dignity, then proposed that he should consent by a secret clause to be added to the treaty to allow the English troops to remain in Malta. This subterfuge was rejected by the First Consul as impracticable and as unworthy of France. At last, wishing to exhaust every means of conciliation, he devised a last expedient, which consisted in allowing the English to retain Malta for an indefinite period, on condition that the French troops should occupy the Gulf of Taranto. Napoleon considered Taranto, as regards its position in the Mediterranean, the equivalent of Malta. It seemed to him that a French occupation of Taranto, accorded by a treaty, would prompt the powers to interfere with a view to force the English to evacuate Egypt so that the French might leave the Kingdom of Naples. But England would make no concessions on this point and refused any price to allow her soldiers to leave the island of Malta. France, on the other hand, was determined to go to war rather than abandon to the English so important a position in the very heart of the Mediterranean. Lord Whitworth refused to even listen to the statement of the arrangement proposed by the First Consul and said that since the sine qua non conditions of his government were refused, he must imperatively demand the return of his passports. And in effect, he left Paris and went to Calais to await the arrival of the General Andreassi at Dover.